blame towards Democrats over the fires.
Mm-hmm.
It's
There's
pretty.
a spreadsheet that I've drawn out.
It's sickening
Mm-hmm.
how deranged they are to blame Democrats for this. Um, it's crazy because like when this stuff happens, like these, the wildfires in California, when this stuff happens in places like Texas, do they blame the governor? Even when the governor
Nope.
is directly responsible? No. The storm destroying middle America right now. They blaming Republican governors that kids are staying home, they can't get back to school? No. They took this situation, which basically they fundamentally don't understand, and they're saying that it's Newsom's fault that they allowed 95% of the water to leave the Sacramento Valley. Do they not understand how far Sacramento is from LA?
No, they don't. Now, as somebody that has made that trip by car, it is something like 400 or 450 miles apart. It's about 8 hours driving. It's nowhere fucking close. It's
Right.
nowhere close.
So that's the argument. Well, they allowed 95% of the water. They did it for environmental reasons. It had to do with the Sacramento floods from last year. You remember? Really devastating.
Mm-hmm.
And they allowed this water to go into the ocean so they didn't erode the soil. And they've since changed this. This would not have changed whether or not they had water. See, Republicans do this where they're like, oh, they're out of water. Why can't they get water? And they did this in Maui as well. They don't understand. These systems, right? They have an operational capacity. You can't just make more water like appear out of nowhere. You have to move it from somewhere. And these houses, right? They're trying to water their stuff down so that their stuff doesn't burn down. As a result, fire hydrants are suffering. As a result, the firefighters can't get water. And then they're saying we're out of water. And they're blaming this thing because somehow California is miraculously supposed to transport this water 6 months in advance to go to a fire that hasn't even happened yet. It's the problem is not that they don't have water, right? It's not that water's not there. It's that they don't have the water pressure. As
Mm-hmm.
someone that previously worked on water lines, I've done a decent amount of work installing water lines. Um, Based on where you are relative to the water tower, your water consumption is or your water pressure is going to fluctuate. So, like if you're up really high, typically it doesn't have as much water pressure. There's not what's called head pressure on that particular faucet. So your water pressure is going to be lower than someone that's at the very bottom of that run. The Palisades are at the top of that run. And even then, if they have their own dedicated water system, which I'm assuming they do and is probably split up among multiple different ones, when you have that much people draining water, the water pressure goes down, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you take a gallon of water, a gallon in a milk jug, and you pour it out, it's going to have significantly more pressure than if you cut it in half and drain it. And so they're trying to blame this on the Democrats. There's not any water, even if they had access to the water, which, by the way,
Which
they
they did.
do. They
Mm-hmm.
do. They have access to bring in new water. They do not have the system that can handle that much water. So they're like, well, why don't they just do all this stuff? I'm pretty sure flying DC, what is it, DC 10s in, 75-mile-an-hour winds, not the move. And even
Mm-hmm.
then, you wouldn't be able to locate it, right? But more so, they're not really fighting like there is a fire line, right? They're fighting house like streets catching on fire, right? So how you mitigate that is significantly different than like just a wildfire in the forest. But I mean, it'd be so real. The incessant blame on Democrats for literally everything, just the Democrat derangement syndrome. It makes me sick. It's just like you guys cannot just take it for what it is. The government controls lasers and the weather, but also when Donald Trump comes into office, you'll just ignore that. Then it won't be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it'll always be the Democrats' fault. It's always the Democrats' fault. It's just such significant and just childish blame shifting. I think that like the problem is like they can't fundamentally conceptualize scale, right? Like they can't, because we see this all the time, right? Where they're like they think that $1 million has the same numerical value as like a billion, right? They
Hmm.
can't understand how much wealth billionaires actually have. They can't understand, like, they'd be like, we send trillions of dollars to Ukraine, right? They don't understand, like, some of these fires that have burned throughout our states, right, Jane and ours, they're larger than states. We're talking about enormous fires, fires larger than some states. And they're like, it's the Democrats can't keep that in control. We're spending a ton of money. And just to point out, right, that because of climate change, we've had to adapt. When I was a kid growing up in Seattle, I don't remember a time that there was a major wildfire going. I think maybe once kind of strings my memory. There wasn't wildfires. Why? Because during the summer, we would have this thing where it would be warm, 75 would be a warm day. And I'm not kidding about this. Throughout my entire childhood, 75 was a warm day. If it got into the 80s, buckle in, right? And it would be like you'd get a month and a half of sun, and then you'd get 2 weeks of rain, and then you get a month and a half. So it's a very mild summer. With the entrance of climate change, we're now seeing 90 plus days on a regular basis. Which, by the way, when I was a kid, we broke the record. It was 96 degrees in Seattle. It was the hottest day ever. We break that every single year. We were not ready to have to deal with these major wildfires, because if they did happen, they were on the east side. There were plains fires, there were grass fires. And now it's burning down entire forests, right? And you just be seeing, like, the forests that are burning down, these trees are 30 years old. Like that, like, we don't, it doesn't happen very often where you see a burned down field. You never did. So we're having to adjust. We're having to create, like California had more experience with wildfires historically, but they're getting more of them. We didn't have them. And so now we're having to invest resources. And the same time we're investing resources, so is a lot of other states, because they're dealing with wildfires now. And so they just think that, like, oh, you can just throw money at it and you can stop wildfires. It's not how it works. Even if we had the crews, these fires are so enormous. Sometimes it takes weeks to figure out how you're going to attempt to contain them, because they just don't stop. Higher winds, especially they're happening in places where they historically weren't, where there are higher winds, like the mountains. And these Republicans are just like, yeah, why don't they just pour water on it? Do you think we would do that? Don't you think we would do that? They go,
Yeah,
oh,
and
well, yeah. They do this thing where they're
right.
like, forest management, forest management. I don't know if you know this, right? But let's assume someone wants to do forest management, which we have in our state. We have contracts, right, where they come in, they clear out about half the trees, and they open it up for elk. They're trying to expand the elk and also to prevent forest fires, right? You're talking about 60% of the state that's covered in forest, maybe even 70. You're talking about an insane amount of land. And you want to set up fire lines every how often in the event that a fire does happen in this region? So you're cutting into the environment, you're cutting into profits of the corporations that own the lands here over something that could potentially happen. And I mean, you're asking for an insane amount of resources to be spent on this. An insane amount of resources. I don't know what they're not understanding about just the scale of how this is. Let's assume, like, oh, you do, yeah. Do you have any, like, if you wanted to do containment on these, right? I'm sorry, Jaden, I'll let you talk. I'm just going to finish this monologue. If you wanted to do containment on these, sure, you go around and cut trees, you cut brush, whatever. Guess what? It's back the next year. So you're constantly going out to having to clear places. And on top of that, making matters even worse, some of these places are not accessible to cars or vehicles. There's no way to stop them. You have to bring in planes, helicopters. You can't get crews up there. You're dealing with these enormous trees, and you have to cut them down. And so you're asking crews while fires are moving in on them to go up there and cut these fire line down. It's an incredibly difficult job. And I don't think they fundamentally understand. And just to be clear, compounding the issue is that frequently where these fires are happening, it's not possible to contain them because the trees are spread out. So in down beneath them, right, especially in eastern Washington, there's grass. There's grass, and it'll just take off. It just takes off. And it's in super inhospitable land. You can go look up I think it was the campfire. I think they called it literally the campfire. But it was in Asotin, Washington, right? It's grassland. I've spent a lot of time there. It's just grassland and trees. There's clusters of trees, grassland. And the mountaintops for them, you can't go up. It's not even like, oh, you could drive. You cannot go up them. It's rock faces. And, Republicans just fundamentally don't understand the gravity. Sorry, go ahead, Gene.
Oh, so, looks like we have somebody in here.
No, that's
All
fine.
right.
He can come
Yeah.
back in.
Wanted to make the point just to dispel this idea that conservatives have been running around with. And there was a post that went viral over on Twitter, and that said, "Look at all the fires and look at all that ocean next to it." Salt water is not the solution to this. We're talking ocean water, salt water with high salt compounds in it. That's going to create a situation where this is a never-ending cycle of brush. What that does is not only does it uproot the plants, but it dries it out, dehydrates them, making them even drier and warmer for these kinds of winds coming in from the Santa Anas, largely from the mountainsides. This creates, a redundant situation of drying out plants and having to put them out again, even if we put them out with salt water from the ocean. So this is a stupid idea. Of course, I'm not
Right.
surprised that people are doubting it.
Yeah, and I don't think that they've really seen like how big these fires are, right?
No.
Because you get to the center of some of them, they're hundreds of feet high, baseball fields high. Like they're enormous. And it's not something that you can just, oh, we're just going to go out and do this. There's a lot of components by the time you plan wind shift, right? And those containment things are very difficult to do, especially when it's dry. So a lot of times what happens is they go, we're going to have to let this whole area burn. We can't put our guys in harm's way. The winds are too fast. And by the time they get around to start of containment, which has just happened, by the way, they're like, how do we start containing? Because the winds, they couldn't figure out a plan. Uh, Suddenly everything's burned down. They're going, oh, look what the Dems did. So, I mean, it's crazy to me as someone that has spent so much time in the woods, right? That they cannot grasp how actually large it is. I would like to go just take a video maybe of how much land we're talking about,
Hmm.
because they can't conceptualize it. We don't have the crews. Period. We don't have the crews. Like we just do not have the crews to fight these fires in the way that they're prescribing. That's just a reality. And this whole deal of we don't have water, the problem is not the water. The problem is the infrastructure to get it there. Right?
And the
Because
pressure
like,
that you need.
well, right. Because like, here's the thing, right? If you wanted to create what they're advocating for, it would be insane. $100 billion plus, it would be crazy. To build that kind of infrastructure because there's so much mountain. You're not just building a pipeline to the Palisades. You're building a pipeline to San Bernardino. You're building a pipeline to Ontario. You're building a pipeline to San Diego. You're building a pipeline to the hills there, and you're talking about thousands of miles of pipeline in the event that a fire does happen somewhere. It's just not really tangible. What Republicans' solutions are is like invest a lot of money in something that we're not going to be able to stop anyways. And even if we could stop it, right? They don't believe in climate change,
Mhm.
so it's just going to get worse. Whatever situation, whatever thing we set up to stop these and contain these fires, it's just going to get worse. California is not just fighting fires in this area, by the way. And I think they don't understand that either. You see this one on the news, there's other fires in the area, right? Oftentimes when they're
Yeah.
fighting one fire, it's because this fire is the most problematic to human life. And so they have to split up resources. But you have 17 DC 10s. I think it's DC 10s. California's invested a ton of money. Washington State, Oregon has invested a ton of money. British Columbia, ton of money. Invested billions of dollars trying to bring wildfires under control. And the Republicans' best solution here as well, just throw money at it that we don't even believe should be taxed. It's as someone that's driven the West Coast more than once, it really is hard to it really is hard to sort of encapsulate how much forest there really is,
Hmm.
and the different types of forest and the different types of terrain. So, this is just stupid political posturing by Republicans. They do it with every natural disaster. It's despicable. And if your goal is to blame Democrats for everything, I guess we're going to start blaming Trump for every disaster that happens under him. If fair is fair. Just a thought.